So those of you who are members of our church or visitors of our church, you know that we've got these beautiful art displays in our church. We have paintings out in the hallway, and then we have these beautiful picture displays here. And when I was trying to figure out a place to do this particular devotional, this is what I thought of as these pictures that are here and what we see in these pictures. And as I was putting together this devotional, that was the thing that came to mind. Have you ever heard that phrase, seeing is believing? Now, if you've ever heard that phrase, the question is, do we believe that to be the case? Do we believe that seeing is believing? Well, as a person of faith, I certainly hope that that's not the case, because essentially what that means is we have to see something in order to believe that it's real, that what makes it real is because we see it. And for me, there's a lot of things that deal with who God is and how God interacts with the world that I don't necessarily always see with my eyes the same way that I may see these pictures. So what do we think about that? Is seeing believing? Or is there something deeper about believing or understanding or connecting with God that isn't about those things we see with our senses, with our eyes? So there's a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. He wrote a couple letters, and in what we call the 2 Corinthians, there's a section in there where he's trying to talk about the hope we have in the gospel and what will happen in the end times. And he's talking about eternal life, and he talks a lot about the bodies that we will have, and it's kind of different for us to kind of look at those passages and understand what he's talking about sometimes. But in the midst of talking about this and talking about what he believes as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, he says in one line, "We walk by faith, not by sight." I mean, honestly, that's in direct disagreement with that question or that statement, seeing is believing. You know, for Paul, he believed and he walked by faith and not by some of the things that he saw going on around him. Because frankly, some of the things he saw going on around him kind of conflicted with those things that he believed with his heart and his mind, the things that he believed God was doing in the world. And so for Paul, this idea of walking by faith and not by sight, living by our faith, having a conviction by what we believe and not just by what we see, was really important to him. And you know what? I think that's good. Because, I mean, here's the thing. Seeing can sometimes become deceptive. I don't know if you ever heard this, but if you have eyewitnesses to an accident or a crime and you sit them down individually in a room, oftentimes what one person says they saw happen is very different from what another person says they saw happen. You see, sometimes even our sense of sight can deceive us. And what we really see is not maybe in context, it's not the full picture. We may pay attention to certain elements of things that another person doesn't pay attention to. And so sometimes we have to recognize that what we see is not going to be where we find the truth. But it's what we sense and feel and come to understand in our hearts and our minds about where God is and how God is leading us. In fact, here's an interesting thing. I looked up that word or that phrase, seeing is believing, and this is what I found. According to Google, and I don't know, maybe Google's not right on this, but I found it in a couple different sources. It said that the full quote came from a 17th century English clergyman by the name of Thomas Fuller. And what he actually said was, seeing is believing, but feeling is the truth. Now, you know, when I first saw that a clergyman had said, seeing is believing, I thought, wow, how can that be? And yet when I read the whole thing, but feeling is the truth, we begin to recognize that there's something about the truth that we sense and we experience from God that can go beyond what we actually see with our eyes. Well, you know, in our church right now, we're in the midst of a stewardship campaign, and some of you who are members of the church got our stewardship stuff, and you may be reading through that, and you see that this is our theme this year, is we walk by faith, not by sight. And as we look as a church right now with where we feel God is calling us to go, we recognize that there are a lot of things that are going on in our culture, in the world around us, that may make us become less bold than what we really are trying to do right now with our stewardship campaign and with our vision, because we're trying to increase our staff. We're trying to grow in a time and in a period when a lot of churches aren't growing, they're shrinking. And we really believe that God's calling us towards this. And so in order for us to proceed, we've got to go by faith, not by sight. But it's not just a church that feels that way either. I mean, you may find yourself in that same situation at some point where you just feel and you know in your heart that God is calling you to do something, but you see other things around you that are contradicting that. So you may find yourself sometimes in your life going, I don't know how to perceive God. I don't know how to go forward because everything around me is telling me something different than what I'm feeling and sensing in my heart. If you've ever felt that, you know what Paul was trying to say. We walk by faith, not by sight. And so perhaps that's the encouragement that you, as an individual person of faith, needs to know today. That you need to walk by faith and not by sight. And perhaps this is the encouragement that we all as a congregation need to feel right now. We need to walk by faith and not by sight because we have been called as individuals and as a church to transform the culture around us. And if we take what we see as the truth, then perhaps we won't be walking in the way in which God has called us. We walk by faith, not by sight.